So maybe while the technical presentation starts, maybe I'll just give a little bit of a brief introduction into the group that made the following paper. It's called Towards a Municipalist Basic Income, and it's made by a collaboration between four different groups. The group is called BIRAL, which stands for Basic Income Research and Action Lab, or BIRAL. We made it up during the pandemic. It's a combination of a collaboration between BIEN. So my name is Julio Linares. I'm part of BIEN. In the EC, I serve as outreach for the last years now. And during the pandemic, we thought that it would be important to create some sort of collaboration between different research entities that are also looking at basic income in practice. So not as a theoretical exploration, but really in practice. And so we reached out to Universidad Federal Fluminense, which is in Brazil, and they are conducting most of the research in Maricá, where the Mumbuca basic income currency is happening at the moment. We also reached out to the GRI Institute, and we have here today with us Gi-hun, who is part of Biral, and he's been doing research on the Gyeonggi-do experience. There's also the Freiburg Institute of Basic Income Studies, or FRIBIS, which I'm sure you are familiar with. We started a research group there to look at the relationship between network science and anthropology to understand the flow of currency when talking about basic income. And I believe that's it. So essentially, it's a collaboration between these four different groups. And I'm just going to check if the presentation is ready.
Your presentation is over, so we can't renew.
Okay, no problem. Maybe I just use the one, the older one. Yeah. Yeah. It's the okay. This is the other presentation.
Oh, no. I'm sorry.
It should be. It's just here.
Wait a minute.
Yeah. And I think so. The reason why we were waiting for the presentation is because I have a video of Andrea Gama, who is the researcher from Brazil, who wanted to introduce the Mumbuca. Since she's not here, and the video cannot be put, I'll do it. This is an older presentation. And then we have Gi-hun. I think Gi-hun is still here. And well, Teodoro, who is part of Freiburg, and myself. So I'll be doing the presentation, as we cannot include the others because of technical difficulties. So, so the purpose of the presentation and the name Towards a Municipalist Basic Income, it's, I have to say, a bit of a misnomer, because we're not only talking about municipalist approaches to basic income. I should mention that I take the inspiration of municipalism from the work of Murray Bookchin, who was a ecologist in the era of the 50s, 60s, 70s, who was mentioned yesterday in one of the presentations. The idea of municipalism, or some sort of internationalist municipalism, refers to a type of politics whereby local governments, in the form of councils, municipal mayors, whatever the form it is, take a more participative, democratic politics towards making policy happen from the bottom up. So that is the sort of exploration where you have a politics where a local municipality can implement whatever is needed at the local level, and then it can federate upwards, right? And so politically, I think that is a very interesting way forward in terms of how do we run governance in the world. Of course, in reality, the it's different from this. But at the same time, we do have examples today of systems that are running and that are based on local governments or self-organized groups issuing out basic income. So the comparison is between the three places. So Brazil in Marika, South Korea, here in Gyeonggi, and in Germany, Berlin, which is where I am based. So the first one, I think I don't have to say too much about it since we're here and you probably know a lot, but I'll try to give a few words. These are some pictures that from both the advertisements from the Gyeonggi Do card you see there. Some farmers, some people turning 24th for the youth dividend. Here we have pictures from Marika, from the Banco Mumbuka, which is the community bank that was set up to issue out the local currency. And it's also a card and a digital payment option. And here are some pictures from Berlin, from a market that we did with the basic income currency there, which is called Circles UBI. So the systems. So this is a first exploration, and I'm very curious to hear what Eduardo will think about this. So the Marika municipality started a pilot with the Banco Mumbuka. So the way it works is that 42,000 recipients, it might be more now, get the basic income in the form of a local currency, which is called Mumbuka. I believe it's named after an indigenous nation, but I'm not completely sure. The way it works is that there is oil revenues that come from a refinery close to the city. So the city has a lot of wealth in that sense. And that money gets given to the municipal government, which then through the Mumbuka issues out the currency, the local currency, the social currency, sort of as a mirror of the reais that are being given in the form of a dividend or a form of revenues, basically. Then that gets given to beneficiaries. So the people that get it is 42,000 people. It's a targeted scheme, so it's for low-income residents, and essentially at the moment, I think it's about 200 Mumbukas a month equals to more or less 200 reais, which is about 39 euro, $40. It works in a way where the beneficiaries can spend this currency locally. So it's not a currency itself, it's a payment system, it's a local payment system. So more than thinking about it as some sort of currency unit that is circulating, it's better to think about it as some sort of structure where people can make payments at the local level, where the basic income is actually being distributed. Now the beneficiaries can spend it at local businesses, and then businesses can spend it with other businesses and also to other beneficiaries of the currency, who then can cash it out for the reais. So the Mumbuka circulation happens in that circle that you see there. And it's interesting, we haven't done network analysis yet on the flow of the circulation of the currency. That's a project that we have in the future, but I think what is important to say here is that the importance of making this type of more local approaches to doing basic income is that the value that is produced at the local level can also circulate and be distributed locally. So that also creates opportunities for infant industry protection at the local level, so production. So it is a lie that, in basic income, we don't care about production. We do. I was just reading an interview yesterday by a critique of a historian who wrote a critique of basic income that Philip had mentioned. I think it's called Welfare for Markets. I really don't like it because they basically are framing basic income as something that comes out of Milton Friedman and something that is actually, in a way, romanticizing the old labor welfare state regime that at the same time doesn't see that the welfare states of the Second World War were based on a lot of imperialism. And I think the beautiful thing about things like the Mumbuka is that these local forms of economic security can actually serve to create economic autonomy in the local level everywhere, which is a very anti-imperialist thing. Now, this is a bit more complex. I won't go into all the details, but Gihun, are you here? Would you like to talk a bit about the Gyeonggi-do? Okay. So the I think these are a bit outdated figures now, but at least for the youth basic income, the currency was given to 170,000 people. Then there was, as you know, the interesting thing about Gyeonggi, the Gyeonggi experience is that it started as a city-wide intervention that then grew to the regional level. And if the governor had won the elections, it would have spread at the national level. So in this, more than looking at the sort of the different bodies, the institutional bodies that came together to make the currency happen, what is interesting is more the political impulse and the political strategy. So the reason why we're pushing now for this municipalist basic income is to say, if we can replicate the experience of what happened here in other countries, then we could have, you know, a fire that lights 1,000 candles, so to say, in the sense that politically at the state level, it's very hard to do basic income, but at the very local level, it's easier to then grow it and scale it up, so to say. So the local government of Gyeonggi worked together with the Korean Mint Corporation and also with the central government, you know, through many proposals back and forth. There was a lot of public administration. There is a very nice tradition of public administration in South Korea that allowed for like a very well-made design, I have to say. So in terms of how the currency works, the Gyeonggi-do pay or the Gyeonggi-do money is given in the form of a debit card. You can pay by QR code, or there's also a form of paper voucher, and it's 1-to-1 to the 1. So it's not convertible for users, only businesses can cash it out. So that creates an incentive for businesses to accept it, and then because they know that they can get the money back from the government. So there is this very direct relationship between the government and the businesses at the local level. For the farmers' basic income, I don't have so much updated details yet, but as far as I understand, the strategy there was to say, you know, Gyeonggi-do is the place where a lot of the technology here in South Korea is made. And so to revitalize things like farming and agriculture, the local currency can help producers of food so that, you know, they can survive and also give things of value like food to people. Would you like to complement? Okay, yeah. Here, then the last project I want to compare here is Circles GPI. Circles is a project that I started, that I co-founded, that I helped to design as a way to do basic income in a form of direct action or in form of a self-organized way. So Circles is a currency that started in 2020 during the pandemic. It became a bit viral at the beginning. We have over 120,000 people all over the world that opened an account. In Berlin, we did a targeted pilot, which I think right now it's a bit less than 1,000 people, but definitely over 5,000 people in Berlin have used it. I think right now we're around 700. This is last year. So the way it works is that we have a subsidy model where the cooperative, the Circles cooperative, gives a promise to pay euros to businesses that accept the Circles currency, so that they have less risk and, you know, more fungibility for the currency. So in that sense, the currency is issued not by me or by the Circles cooperative. It is issued on a peer-to-peer issuance model. So what does that mean? It means that, just to maybe refresh memories on how the current monetary system works, you have a situation where central bank issues out debt that gets given to private banks with an interest, and then the private banks decide to issue out debt to industry and businesses with a bit of a higher interest, and then eventually that gets to people in the form of wages and debt and so on, right? So what we're trying to say with is that in the Circles model, the actor that is issuing the money is people, from the bottom up, so to say, in the sense that the promises, if you think of money as a form of debt, as my late advisor, David Gray, would like to say, and debt being a series of promises that we make to one another. In the design of Circles, what we're thinking is that people should be the ones to be, should be the ones who should have the power to issue money outwards. So We take, of course, inspiration from MMT, modern monetary theory, even though they don't really like us, but their analysis is correct. I like to think more about DMT, or democratic money theory, as in people should claim the power to issue money, issue promises out into the world as an income that then can, ripple into other ways. So the redemptions happen in circles on a one-to-one basis. So you have one circle per hour that is issued. So you have 24 circles a day, or 720 per month. And the amount of money that people get in Europe is quite small. It's not a full basic income, obviously. This is a self-organized22 It's about 72 euros at the moment. And what the experience has taught us in circles is that the question of basic income no longer becomes where will the money come from, because the money can be effectively issued out, like we can make it ourselves, just like central banks do. The question is, where will the stuff come from? So now this is, here I would like to put my Marxist hat on for a second, if you allow me. When we're talking about dependency between the center and the periphery today, so the center being Europe and the global south being the periphery, as Jason Hickel likes to say, the developing countries are developing the developed countries, in the sense that a lot of the wealth upon which Europe rests upon comes from the cheap labor and cheap goods that come from the south. And so at the moment, if you're a farmer in a place like Brandenburg, which is the region that surrounds Berlin, it is very expensive to make tomatoes. So one ethnographic example I can give you from a farmer that we work with is that for a farmer in Brandenburg, when they grow tomatoes and they sell them at the nice hipster bio shop in Berlin, what often ends up happening is that their tomatoes are 50 cents, even €1 more expensive than the ones that come from, for example, Andalusia in Spain, which is normally grown with slave labor or migrant workers who have no working conditions. So you have a situation where at the center of like a place like Germany, which is an economic political power, growing food is non-economical anymore. So farmers depend a lot on subsidies. The situation is not as bad as in a place like India, obviously, but there are constant farmer suicides, not just in Germany, also in places like France. And so if we're thinking about things like degrowth today, which is a very nice idea, I think it could do some work on their narrative. But if we actually are thinking about scaling down the production of this world system that we have, where Europe and places like more imperialistic countries benefit from the periphery, people often ask me, why do you do a pilot in Germany and not in Guatemala, where I'm from? I always say, well, because of imperialism. Like, if we don't have economic autonomy in Europe, Europe will continue to colonize countries like Guatemala for resources. No? So for me, it's an interesting question to think about, not where the money comes from, because that we can effectively make, but how could we create the autonomy necessary in Europe and the US and Canada and other countries, so that we can really create economic democracy for all everywhere. So this is the sort of outcome from the experience so far of circles. This is just some pictures from the network science that we use. Yeah, 5 minutes. Yeah, thank you so much. So I think it's important to say that basic income and conditional basic income introduces a paradigm shift in how we do this thing that is called the economy, and so we therefore require new methodologies that go beyond things like randomized control trials. So this is an example of a picture of the network of in circles. So the big dots and like the lines represent interactions with each other, and the dots represent clusters where people are trading. So in network science, you use things like arborescence, cyclical motifs, strongly connected components, and so on. I won't go into the details. I can do in the questions, but I think maybe just on this slide, I would say that my co-author Teodoro Cricione, he did a study in Kenya with local currencies, where they issue out a local currency to one community, and they see what happens over time. And what they say is that the currency actually moves to like 50 villages or more around. So to do something like a control group in a place like Kenya, when you issue out a local currency, or when you do a basic income intervention, it's actually hard to do some sort of isolation. So if you actually look at the flow of money, when you do an intervention in one place, it will affect the other. So if you're really serious about looking at like the complex dynamics of, how, basic income affects people, we have to rethink what control means, just from a methodological point of view. And so a bit of a synthesis to end. How do the systems differ and how are they similar? So they're all of the systems are unconditional and individual, but they're not universal, right? So, circles is anyone could join in the network. So we have people that are migrants from all over the world, some with papers and without papers. We have Germans from different social classes. In the context of Korea, it's for the youth, it's for some farmers, for artists, and in the context of Marika, it's very targeted for people with low incomes, at least for now. It is, the similarity is that paid in local currency or local payment networks, which might be a more approximate thing. And yeah, in terms of the beneficiaries, as I said, the reach differs depending on the design of each of the systems and policies. So I think I won't go into commodity credit money theory right now because I don't have time, but just to say that what these three examples show is that the role of the municipalities or the role of local counties, cities, regions, and self-organized groups like the cooperative that I made in Berlin can lead to a politics. So as Jürgen was saying the other day, that I think it's not only that we have to go from defending the pilots that we have to think about our pilots politically and think about how our pilots can be turned into policies. And I think through this type of basic income currencies, we can actually leverage the power that they have to turn the pilots into policies very actively. Yeah, here's just a comparison table. I think I don't have much time, but basically, yeah, it's just summarizing what I said. And yeah, as I mentioned, from pilot to policy. Here are some pictures of the cards and the payment systems again. And yeah, just to conclude very quickly, going back to this idea of internationalist municipalism, imagine a world where we could have a network of basic income currencies, basic income towns, villages that can talk to each other, connect to each other, have networks. You can scale that up in a federation type of way. And as I said, basic income systems act in this sense as political and social incubators. And we need to think about beyond MMT. So we have to expand the fiscal and monetary powers that local constituents can have. So we move from a world where only central banks can issue money as debt to a world where local governments could issue money as a basic income. And so, yeah, the focus here is on value creation, on production, on local production, local economic linkages, circulation, and autonomy at the local level. So how do we create, as I said again, more regional supply chains that are more social and ecological? And yeah, basic income in praxis. So through the segmented, 5 principles of basic income, we can grasp the essential meaning of each of them and apply them in practice. So while the systems that we name are not a full basic income, as the definition says, they're incomplete, but their incompleteness is part of what makes them real and what allows us to, then reach the utopia that, as Eduardo Galeano said, the utopia is useful because if I walk one step, the utopia goes another step, and the utopia is useful because it helps me to walk. So thank you very much.
Okay, before we have questions, comments on that paper,
in Marika, in October, about half of the population will have the basic income. And at the end of 2024, all inhabitants living there for 3 years or more will be having the basic income. So it will be for everyone. Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you,
Okay.
Eduardo.
Okay, who is going to get the next presentation on Luciano? Yeah,
He's online, I think.
who's putting it up? What? Oh, he's there. Okay.
Hi, can people hear me?
Yeah. Think so.
Would it be better for them to put my presentation up or for me to share my screen?
Put it up, I think. Can you put it up?
Wait a minute. 이거구나. 아, 이거구나. 아, 예.
You can see the presentation.
That's it.
Okay.
So I'll just have to let you know when to change slide, I suppose. Okay, so just a reminder, it's 15 minutes for each one, yeah?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Just let me set a timer so I don't ramble on. Here we go. All right. Yeah, so thank you so much, everyone. If I could have the next slide, please.
Next slide. Yeah.
That's right.
So this is just a little bit about me. My name's Luciano Carment. At the moment, I'm an honorary associate in the discipline of political economy at the University of Sydney, the same university as Troy Henderson. Basically, briefly on my background, my area is more heterodox macroeconomics and critical macrofinance. My own research focuses primarily on inflation. And this paper is going to be my first foray into the world of basic income. And I think that's all I need to say about me. And I sort of discovered basic income through, I'm also a research assistant to Dr. Gareth Bryant, who is one of the co-founders and one of the directors of the Australian Basic Income Lab, where Troy Henderson also works. So I can have the next slide, please.
Next slide.
So I think just to give some context for what I'm going to talk about here today, I have sort of divided, I think the basic income literature can be very crudely divided really into two literatures. There is a literature about basic income, which very much has its roots in political theory. So, for examples, the work of the late Eric Olin Wright, Philippe Van Parijs, and this literature very much is based on a philosophical, often a normative approach, talking about basic income, a generous or emancipatory basic income that would imply the freedom from the obligation to work for a wage. And then there is another basic income literature, which is very much a policy literature. It explores how basic income would impact immediate budgetary dynamics, or it examines pilot schemes and talks about how they've interacted with budgetary dynamics. Oftentimes, this literature, though not always, is focused around a less generous basic income, sometimes phrased as a revenue neutral basic income. And an example from the Australian context, which is what I'm most familiar with, would be Troy and Ben Spice Butcher's work with Phillips in 2020, a couple of related papers as well. So I think between these two literatures, there is a kind of a missing middle of an abstract or a generic macro approach to basic income. So if we could get the next slide, please.
Next slide. Yep.
So in terms of a macroeconomics of basic income approach, I think there is some skepticism towards the concept of a generic macro of basic income. And I understand that impulse to a certain degree. I think it's reasonable to argue that every national or local context is going to have path-dependent features that would radically change the implementation of a basic income policy. But I think this kind of research that talks about the generic macroeconomics of a basic income is important because unfortunately, we still live in a world where policy making is, in the kind of neoclassical paradigm, still created with appeals to generic macroeconomic rules. I think we've seen a good example of this. Recent debates over central banking policy have made constant appeals to the generic concept of a Taylor rule, for example. And any policy that's going to be sold to policymakers on the national level needs to be able to answer the question of whether or not it's inflationary. Whether or not a policy is perceived to be inflationary, I think radically constrains its perceived feasibility. So with that kind of aside, that context aside, I can talk about the approach that I'm taking in this paper. So next slide, please. So the broader question of whether a basic income would be inflationary, I think, needs to be divided into 3 sub-questions. And for the purposes of time, I'm just going to focus on one of those 3, the most important of those 3 sub-questions today. So really, whether a basic income would be inflationary in an abstract macroeconomic sense comes down to what would the labor supply response be, what would be the effect on productivity, and what would be the role of indexing in this imaginary basic income scheme. So today I'm going to focus just on really the sort of $10 million question, which is the question of the labor supply response. Next slide, please. So in my paper, the basic model I'm using to talk about how the labor supply response could work for a basic income scheme is a model that I've taken from the work of Samuel Bowles, the neo-Marxian microeconomist. This model is called a worker's best response curve. So Samuel Bowles actually has done a little bit of work on basic income himself a long time ago, in 1992. But this model of best response curve comes up from some of his other work. I think it's useful in that it can speak the language of the basic neoclassical concept of a labor market, but it discards some of the most problematic assumptions associated with mainstream labor market theory. So it's a game theory type model and it has some conventional assumptions. Firms profit maximize, there's absolute disutility of work, but it diverges from the mainstream very crucially in that it does not assume a full employment equilibrium wage. It doesn't assume that the wage is the reward for workers' marginal productivity. It gets us a little closer to Robinson's famous statement that I love, the level of the money wage obtaining at any particular moment is a historical accident. So let's have a little bit of a look at this model. Next slide, please. So this is what a basic best response curve looks like. You can see there's effort per hour on the y-axis and a nominal hourly wage on the x-axis. The profit maximizing wage is the point where the worker's best response curve meets the employer's isocost line, their minimal feasible cost. The way the model is constructed is in this game theory way, where you imagine that there's 2 agents that trade off offers until you reach this Nash equilibrium point. The really important thing for our purposes here is that the worker's best response curve does not start at 0. It starts at this point that Bowles calls the reservation wage, R. And this is where we get the assumption that there is no such thing as a equilibrium full employment wage pertaining at any particular time, this kind of very bogus neoclassical assumption. So if we could jump to the next slide, I'll talk about this reservation wage. So what determines this reservation wage? The reservation wage is basically the point at which in this model, a worker will be indifferent towards, it's the wage offered at which a worker will be indifferent towards working or not. And this is something that is socially, institutionally, and historically constructed. It's constructed by macroeconomic dynamics like unemployment levels, unemployment benefits, other social benefits, but also totally non-government social support structures in different contexts, the church, family support structures, etc. And it also is about the nature of the work in the industries that dominate locally. How unpleasant is it, the work that people are being offered wages to do? Let's go to the next slide, please. So when we're talking about a basic income level, I think we can blow up this best response curve to a kind of macro perspective where we would have an aggregate reservation wage that holds in the aggregate for the entire labor force. And the question in the short to medium term of a basic income is, ceteris paribus, all other things being equal, a basic income will only have a negative effect on the participation rate, labor supply, once it exceeds this aggregate reservation wage level. So if we think of the aggregate reservation wage at the aggregate point at which workers are indifferent between employment or non-employment, it's only once the basic income exceeds that point that you'll start to see a diminution of the labor supply. Next slide, please.
Next slide.
I think if we're going to have this concept of a reserve wage, then it makes sense also to have the concept of a ceiling wage. So that is the point beyond which pure remuneration in nominal terms stops mattering in terms of people's decision to work or not to work. So this is where we bring in the concept of, non-monetary remuneration for work. There are many reasons other than monetary remuneration that people work. Teachers teach because they want to teach, social workers work because they want to aid society, etc. There's a million examples we could come up with. So the question for a basic income in the short to medium term becomes, in the given context that we're talking about, how close or far is the gap between the reservation wage and the ceiling wage? What is the gap in any given context between destitution and contentment in employment? If we could have the next slide, please. I think an important point for the two literatures that I was discussing earlier here is that in this approach of talking about the labor supply response in terms of an aggregate best response curve, we can see that the revenue neutral concept of a basic income and a more generous or emancipatory basic income are more than just 2 points on a continuum. They are, in terms of their relationship to the reserve wage, they are two different policies. A revenue neutral policy is, as long as it's below that reserve wage level, not the same thing as a more generous or emancipatory basic income, which is going to have, in this kind of conceptual framework, a short to medium term effect on the labor supply. And so I think here we get into perhaps this, I think, if we're being generous, it is more than just a semantic point to talk about the difference between a generous and non-generous basic income, because they are going to have they're going to pass some threshold in the aggregate where their effect on the concept of a basic income is essentially different. If we could have the next slide, please. So this still leaves us with the question of the long term. And I think, when you're talking to policymakers, they never really want to know about the long term. So that's why I've kind of focused on the short and medium term here. And also, I think the discipline of macroeconomics, even outside of the mainstream, even sort of heterodox macroeconomics, is very poor at dealing with long-term questions. There is the famous quote from Keynes that in the long term we're all dead. But I think we do need to think about the long term as well, because here the dynamic potentially changes again. I think in the long term, a basic income would likely not interact with a reservation wage. It would begin to define the level of the reservation wage if it became an entrenched part of social policy itself. So here there are, I think, countervailing possibilities in terms of the labor supply response. Competition between basic income and wages could push the reservation wage up or pull it down, depending on the dynamic that ensued. The reduction in involuntary unemployment could push the reservation wage up, but that itself could be counteracted by changes in the level of productivity and therefore output, which have long-term effects on the level of the reservation wage, especially via the setting of minimum wages. And we've got to remember that the interaction of minimum wages and basic income is going to significantly complicate the determination of a reservation wage for any given context. So I think probably like most, the title of my presentation promised answers, but I've mostly just delivered a series of questions. But I think it's important that we are not afraid to try and provide some answers to these abstract macroeconomic questions and not be afraid to provide incomplete answers or answers that raise more questions, because, you know, for better or worse, we do have a policy-making schema that operates within kind of a recourse to these abstract macroeconomic principles. And so hopefully this, you know, the idea of this paper is it pushes a little bit in a direction of trying to answer some of these questions without recourse to the neoclassical concept of wages being this kind of reward for the marginal utility of workers, which is just never going to be compatible with, you know, really trying to honestly theorize how a basic income could affect macroeconomic dynamics like inflation, basically because, you know, that those kinds of theories can barely even wrap their heads around the concept of a minimum wage. So I think there's no chance of them getting their heads around basic income. And I think that's my time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Well, our third speaker has not appeared. I hope that doesn't mean his injury is greater than he implied. So I think it'd be useful if we had a round of questions or comments, and then give the two speakers a chance to respond to those. So who would like to start off? Yeah. If you, we have a system here. Those of you who weren't here, you have to come down to the thing because we only have the microphone there. Or you can use this. No, you won't be seen. Oh, that's correct.
Thank you very much for that. My name's Peter Brake from the Universal Entitlement Charitable Trust. It's a question for Julio. The size of the circle that you've got going in Berlin with 700 participants sounds as if you'll have the same problem with a lot of green dollar schemes around the world where farmers struggle to spend the money that they're earning because of the number of participants and the number of different qualified people or fertilizer producers. How have you got over their lack of ability to spend the money that they're earning?
Thank you so much. This is a very good question. I think it's important to say that because we're not the government, we don't have the same capacities to, say, destroy the money or take it out of circulation or create the incentives that a state would do. So normally, you know, what would happen is that if we were sort of a municipal sort of entity, the farmers could say, okay, I'm gonna accept this currency and then I'm gonna use it to pay my taxes or for utilities. No, so that's how they can actually spend. It creates an incentive for them to spend the money that they got from this internal liquidity that was created. No, this market that was created by people spending their units. No, what we do in our sort of one of our sort of policy goals, let's say, is to create to-be transactions. So find the people that allow farmers, in this case, to be able to spend their circles. So in that case, in German, it's like things like like Steuerberater, like a tax advisor, someone who can help with taxes, people who can help with, marketing, or people who are more like food retailers. So for example, we work with a group that does food upcycling. They take food from farmers or that normally would go to waste, and then they turn it into finished products for people and food. So we try to create these local linkages so that they have more abilities to spend. And then we also have the cash out option into euros so that they can, reduce their risk, right? So I think it's about creating the linkages, the economic linkages so that they can find ways to spend the circles or the units that they take, no? But this isn't a problem in Maricá and Gyeonggi because the government says, we'll take your money. So businesses have the incentive, to do it.
Okay, can we have the online questioner? Hello?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah. Okay,
Do
go
you hear
ahead.
me?
Yes.
My name is Wonjali, and I actually designed the rural basic income in Gyeonggi province as a researcher and pre-tested it. And then I joined the Gyeonggi province as a policy advisor and full-time policy advisor. And I actually was in charge of that experiment until last month. I'm out of Gyeonggi province right now as I'm an independent researcher. And since I have observed the rural basic income experiment in Gyeonggi province, I would like to ask a simple question and maybe a little comment. I think since this is a scientific experiment, we did a full comprehensive survey. But what I observed for 1.5 years experiment, I observed two issues were arising, and that's pretty interesting for me. One is population was growing. So since it's 4,000 people closed community, and everyone is getting basic income there. So unlike other provinces and municipalities around that region, people are moving in to this rural basic income location. It's like a 10% increase for 1.5 years. So it's a huge increase in Gyeonggi province, like this kind of remote village. So that's one thing. And second observation was entrepreneurship. I don't have an exact number since it's not yet season for an interim test. We just pre-tested it. But I just observed a lot of businesses are coming in, like small local restaurants or like a small mom and pop shops. So what I was wondering that even though this is called a pilot, if we can have some consensus, can we do you think we can name this as just a rural basic income, not instead of rural basic income pilot? It's a independent basic income scheme in that local community, and then we can persuade people like population is increasing and entrepreneurship is booming, so that the constituencies like interest groups and politicians in that region can be persuaded. And then we can make a case there and then expand it to other places with this this logic. So do you think this is feasible, or does it sound really logical?
Yes, thank you so much for your intervention, and I will be super curious to read more about your work and research. I would say yes, of course. Like I think we're at least with this research group, we're trying to move beyond thinking about it as pilots, but moving towards systems, basic income systems, or schemes, as you said. I think politically it carries a lot of power. Sorry, sorry. So yeah, I think politically it carries a lot of power because when you're talking about the things you mentioned, that there's this mom and pop shops coming in, population is increasing. That seems to be a very big important value here in South Korea. So it's definitely something that can mobilize affect people's wishes, values, and so on. So definitely we should not call them just pilots because they're effectively systems, and we should see them as systems, as complex systems, and analyze them as such, including the political dimension. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I would like to put a question to Luciano. To what extent can the macroeconomic work around basic income take account of behavioral findings from pilots? Now, many years ago, I did work on the reservation wage, and I differentiated between a reservation wage, the wage at which a person would grudgingly or otherwise accept a job, right? and an aspiration wage, which is somewhat higher than the reservation wage, the wage at which I'll put an effort into doing a good job. And there's a difference, and it relates to the findings that we've had with our pilots, which is contrary to neoclassical prejudice. When people are paid a basic income, they increase the amount of work they do, not reduce the amount of work. And this is something, a behavioral finding. So I would like to see some nuance introduced in those curves, because I think if you move the basic income outside that revenue neutral envelope, as it were, you would actually increase supply. And if you went beyond that, then you might have this downward thing. And it would be interesting to incorporate some of the other behavioral implications. So I'd like to hear what, if you sort of can relate to that, Luciano.
Yeah, I really like this idea of an aspirational wage. And I think the paper itself, I didn't really have time to get into this. The framework that it uses for inflation is what's sometimes called a wage price inflation framework or a conflicting claims framework. And the reason I like that type of framework is that it basically thinks of inflation as the interaction between three elements: wages, profits, and productivity, because productivity is what's going to condition the size of the amount of output that is then a zero-sum distribution between wages and profits. And I agree that I think what I'm struggling with in the construction of this paper, but what I think we need to get away from, is the automatic assumption that a basic income will lower aggregate productivity. And that's something, a very important insight that can be drawn from these pilot studies, is you have study after study that demonstrates that basic income is not bad for individual worker productivity. It's good for productivity. And the concept that a basic income is inherently inflationary, which interestingly even comes up in some basic income work, this assumption that there's some inherently inflationary quality to basic income, I think is not necessarily correct, because of exactly what you're saying, that the effect, if, in very simple terms, if you have this conflict inflation-based view, if the whole pie is growing because of an aggregate increase in productivity, it actually doesn't matter, even if there is some negative impact on the labor supply response. It doesn't actually matter, because the entire surplus that is to be distributed is growing. I think the added difficulty that gets into is, are we going too much down the path of having these kind of pro-growth arguments, which then reflect back in a complicated way on the pilot studies, to get back to that question of pilot studies. The pilot studies are can be somewhat kind of linked in with a degrowth mentality. So those are complicated questions, but I think that's a really good point. And I like that concept of differentiating between a reservation and aspiration wage.
Yeah, but before I turn over to Kaori, Kishi, and then Peter, let me just have a follow-up to that, if I may, Christian. We did a big pilot in India where we gave everybody in a community the basic income, and we did it for 9 communities. And at the end of 2-year period, average prices had gone down. Okay, because productivity increased, demand had increased, but supply had increased as a consequence of a guaranteed source of demand. And I don't think one should assume necessarily that giving a basic income is going to have an inflationary effect. It can actually operate to lower unit prices. So I think that is another finding, but you can only get from a saturation type basic income, which is a proper basic income where the whole community gets it. And too many of the pilots have only been random selection of individuals, so you don't pick up those macro effects. But maybe I'll turn over to Kaori Kishi. Can you?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. My name is Kaori Kishi, and I'm studying. I'm teaching social studies at high school in Japan. I would like to ask questions to Julio. As you have already known, MMT economists insist taxes drive money. I want to confirm if locally issued currencies, especially in Berlin, used taxes used as a tax, so that these currencies were circulated. Sorry, do you understand that what I mean?
So the question is about MMT's conception of how money is created and destroyed through taxes and through monetary creation, and
Yes.
its relationship to local currencies.
Yes, yes.
Okay. So maybe for people who are not familiar with the MMT cult, basically the way in which money is created today, and this is a descriptive analysis, is not a sort of a policy analysis, is that money is coming into being when, for example, state issues out debt, or a bank issues out that makes a deposit, let's say, and then it gets destroyed through taxation. Now, this is the MMT sort of approach to understanding how money is created and destroyed. So there is this sort of pull and push dynamics, whereby the state is, or the central bank is actively trying to regulate the monetary supply based on whatever economic dynamics are happening, at least in theory, of course. And yeah, there's all these questions of sovereignty, blah, blah, blah. At the local level, you have a similar yet slightly different dynamic. In the case of circles, the model is one in which people are the ones who are issuing out the money, but it's not issued out with a debt, or sort of with an interest-bearing debt. So it's issued out directly as positive units that people can then use to spend. And what we do to sort of take the money out of circulation is something that in the local currency literature is known as demi-rash. So the famous figure here in the 20th century was someone called Silvio Gesell, who has this book called The Natural Economic Order. He's a controversial figure in Germany. I won't go into details why, but this idea of having a money that rots over time or that melts over time is basically what the sort of design of the currency can do. So you can have a system where a money can be issued out, and then after some time it can rot or melt or be destroyed. This is how circles currently works. I want to Thank you. It's just run out of battery. Sorry. I just wanted to say that I'm writing a book now called Decolonizing Money, and one of the chapters will be about cacao money. So how cacao was used in Mesoamerica for thousands of years as a means of payment, means of exchange, and so on. And it was a currency that you could not hoard because the money supply is issued out by trees, and you can only harvest it twice a year, and you can only keep it for a maximum a year. So you actually had to eat the money. And so this is a very different conception of how we think of money today, but just to say that, you can have different ways in which, and this is also pedagogical, like ways in which money can exist and be, and it has over thousands of years. So going back to your question, yeah, in local currencies or sort of municipalist ways, you can also have forms of local levies or taxations as a way to take the money out of circulation. So it's the same principle, basically. You just there's two levers, one to create it and one to destroy it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Well, come here and
No, let's see if my understanding of modern monetary theory was, well, let's assume that the money is issued by the government or the central bank directly into the accounts of individuals, which is something like the circular. And the issue of inflation is really one of capacity utilization. Are we close to capacity utilization or not? And I think that's what Guy was getting at. And so the sort of static view is not appropriate, really, because you have this dynamic creation of entrepreneurship and production that is stimulated by this. And if it's enough, you're not going to have inflation. And if you start from a position well below capacity utilization, you're not going to have it. So I think a static graph of that kind may not be too productive in terms of understanding the mechanisms.
Thank you, Peter.
You want to respond? And then Christian, do you have any? Luciano, Paula, sorry. No, Julio, if you have any response to Peter?
Yeah, maybe I'll connect Peter's thing.
Then I'll come back to Luciano.
To Luciano. Basically, yes, Peter, you're right. Like, I think going back to what Guy was saying and also the presentation of Luciano, like, you have a situation right now where actually people's most underutilized resource is their time. Their time is being eaten up by wages. So if you give the money directly, then you open up a huge space of possibilities of what can happen. This is also going back to what Jorge was saying yesterday. I think there is an element here that also needs to be addressed also in the literature more, because I've gotten into fights with MMT, people in the US where they say, oh, what is this basic income? You're magic thinking, like, who will do the labor, basically? If people get basic income, who will do the labor? This is the response that I often get. And I think, and I see Scott being like, I know. I mean, Scott is reading a whole book about this. I think there is definitely a lack in the literature of addressing this problem. And I say it for you, Luciano, because there's definitely not enough theoretization going on there of like, who will do the labor once people get basic income? Basically, what the argument that they're saying is that at the end of the day, someone else will do the labor. Like, if you give people free money, you're basically putting the burden on someone else. I don't think that's the case, but this needs to be addressed.
I agree. Luciano, have you got a comment you want to make?
Yeah, I think the question of capacity utilization is an important one on the production and demand side. I disagree slightly with the characterization that the MMT characterization of inflation. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, as we've seen in the last 3 years in terms of the potential for global cost push factors. But I think the fundamental point about capacity is a good one, and something that really frustrates me about debates about inflation at the moment, which is never taken into account by the mainstream, is that poverty is inflationary. I mean, this is the really powerful argument for a basic income from an inflationary perspective. Poverty causes inflation, and there is no means to address that in the conventional theory that governs central banks. And I think, there's an advocate for basic income, Rutger Bregman, the historian, puts it very neatly when he makes the sort of descriptive statement that poverty is a temporary lack of cash. There is a simple solution from the macroeconomic perspective for dealing with poverty, which is to give people money. And that money works its way back into circulation. And if you have massively underutilized capacity, as you do even in developed economies right now, then you can actually, the concept that you can never grow your way out of an inflationary situation, I think, is incorrect. And that capacity utilization point makes it fairly well.
Any further questions or comments that people would like to make?
I have a sort of discussion point for Luciano, which is that maybe there is a good literature out there by this Canadian political economist. I forgot his name now, but he's part of this capitalist power school. And he talks about inflation as a process of redistribution. So I think that's actually a more sort of empirical way of looking at how, you have social classes, and some social classes own assets and the other ones don't. And so when the price is increased by one class, or credit is issued out by one class, then the other ones have to pay for that increase in prices, right? So in a way, basic income is a redistribution of ownership and also of assets and so on. So yeah, there is some maybe a theory there of inflation. I don't know.
Okay.
No, I really like that approach. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Please go.
No, go for it, Luciano.
I really like that approach. In my thesis, which was recently was accepted at the end of last year, I talk about there's two basic ways to understand inflation. The conventional view is a monetary view, and it's an extremely superficial view because it is a monetary view. Inflation is a distributional process. It is a way of adjusting the macro price structure, because all inflation, and this is what I always say to my students, inflation is monetary only because we use money for every transaction. Inflation is actually a distributional process, and it's a way for the macro price structure to adjust. And there is a power structure in that macro price structure, and power is going to be distributed between buyers or sellers, between profit earners or wage earners. And so inflation is a question of, governments at the moment infuriatingly talk about inflation as though it's some kind of naturally occurring disaster, like a tidal wave, and it is a power adjustment in the macro price structure. That's all it is. I think it's distributional at its core.
Good point. I'd like to conclude by asking Julio a more general question, which is in the three municipal experiments, as it were, have you got a program of evaluating the outcomes, the effects in the three areas? Do you have a program of evaluation?
Yeah, so I mean, the study is more comparative for now. We're trying to compare first the systems, how they work, how their sort of structure is in terms of, how institutionally the money is issued out, either through oil dividends or through, taxation or in government spending, value-added land taxes, etc., or direct redistribution. Then the other question is like the labor elements we're looking at, especially in Maricá, what's happening there. Because it's not just the Mumbuca that is being given, there's also other sorts of, things like Bolsa Familia and other sorts of like worker support programs. So yeah, we're trying to compare basically what are the effects on different domains. So things like labor, things like economic linkages. We're trying to use network science for that to understand more like the flow of money, but we don't have like the classic pre, during, and post, like type of a methodology to understand like the development of the pilots over time. We're a very precarious group, but yes, it would be nice to do that.
That's
Exactly.
right. Let me record. 9 communities where the basic income was, and we had 12 communities which were the control group. So we did a modified randomized control trial. And I was confronted with a situation halfway through when people said, well, a girl in one of the villages of the control group has moved to marry a man who's in the basic income recipient villages. What do we do? Do we give the woman a basic income or not? And it's that same thing with your flow of money, the flow of marriage partners. So it caused a problem. I won't tell you the solution that we came up with, but it does cause problems. So thank you very much for listening. If nobody has further comments, we can all conclude. Okay.
Thank you
very much,
Thank you,
Luciano, for your contribution.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I'm sure we all wish Troy a speedy recovery.